Hello everyone, I'm Miss Rubio, and today we're going to talk about the philosophical context of Kant, also historical, maybe a little bit generally into the history of what was going on before Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, and we will also analyze the preface to the Critique of Pure Reason, take the main quotes, and yeah, exciting, fascinating. Only if you like Kant, if not, it's not going to be fascinating. But I think we can make a good video here, right? We're going to be the context of this video. So first, I'm going to talk the Enlightenment and its crisis, something that you already may know. Then I will move on to German rationalism. I will stop and specify, talk more about Leibniz and some of his ideas in very general terms. By the way, this is just an introduction, so I'm in no way making really specific claims here. I am just merely a third-year student at a UK university, and this is just part of my dissertation research. So if you know more than me, you're more than welcome to roast me. Please do it. Right, okay, then the third point is influence, the influence of rationalism on Kant, what things Kant took on board into his ideas, but then what things he also rejected. Then four is Kant's Copernican revolution. We will know, we will get to know what that is, what does it involve, and where it comes from. Then five is the issue of contingency and the principle of sufficient reason, which we're going to take from Leibniz in Kant's historical context. That is a little bit necessary to understand some of the things that Kant took on board and then led him to write the Critique of Pure Reason. Then number six is Kant's response to Anselm's ontological argument for the existence of God. I'm just randomly adding that because I thought it was interesting. And then the certainty of philosophy, just a couple of remarks, and finally a close reading of Kant's preface in the Critique of Pure Reason. Cool, lovely. So before we get into the content, so the bibliography that I have used for this video is mainly, obviously, the Critique of Pure Reason. I'm using the Norman Kemp Smith translation, and that's a picture of my edition. And also I'm using a Desmond Hogan article, Kant's Copernican Turn and the Rational Tradition, which is a really, really, really interesting piece of writing. It helped me a lot to understand many aspects of Kant's context, so I really, really recommend. And also I'm using Paul Goyer's chapter 1 of his book, Kant, published in 2014. All right, go. Well, now that we've made all these remarks, let's go over to the Enlightenment and its crisis. Right, what was going on during the Enlightenment? So, first of all, Kant was born in Königsberg in 1724. He lived all his life there until his death in 1805. We have no records that he actually left his village. And he lived during the Enlightenment period. So we all know about the Enlightenment period, the famous century of light, the rebirth of science and reason, that takes some aspects from the Renaissance. Cool, and that became a turning point of the 18th century, and mainly the main ideas are two main ideas. If you want to simplify it a lot, you would get that they were fighting a war against superstition. So all beliefs must not submit to superstition, they must submit to reason. Everything must be rational, well-founded. There was a radical questioning of absolutely everything we already took for granted before. And all parts of nature, let it be our nature, human nature, or plants, animals, anything, all parts of nature must be rationalized using mathematics, physics, science, and not any magical unknown forces. That also led to a little bit of a crisis of religion, but we're not going to get into that. Cool. The second thing was it was also a war of despotism. Okay, despotism. So there was a rejection of absolute monarchs, non-constitutional monarchs that were not elected by the public, and also against the church. People, thinkers from the Enlightenment, thought that there should be a moral progress. So we need to work towards human equality, freedom, and self-determination. So Kant was familiar to all of this. He was familiar to all of this with the idea of the Enlightenment, and he even provided a definition. Okay, and this is the definition that he provided. I'm going to read it out loud. He said that the Enlightenment is the human being's exit from his self-incurred immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to make use of one's own understanding without direction from another. This immaturity is self-incurred when its cause lies not in a lack of understanding, but in lack of resolution and courage to use it without direction from another. Sapere aude. Have courage to make use of your own understanding is thus the motto of enlightenment. Beautiful quote. That is AA 835 if you want to check it out. Cool. All right, so this is what he says about the Enlightenment. So basically he's saying we grow up holding some beliefs, we just accept, and we carry like a walking cart, but we need to get rid of that walking cart and learn to walk on our own. He is an he's an enlightenment thinker, Kant that is. He's an enlightenment figure in a way, and not in some others, but you could interpret that Kant could be an enlightenment thinker. At least that's what he was what's going on during his era. But the Enlightenment was also facing a crisis, especially at the end of the 18th century. And I've highlighted the three main problems of the Enlightenment. That again, those were going on during Kant's period. So the first one was the problem of freedom and determinism. So we already have Newtonian laws in physics, okay? So that Newtonian picture of the world is deterministic. Everything involves an action and a reaction, okay? That's always going to happen, that's deterministic. But how are we going to make that work with moral agency? Moral agency, so us being responsible for our actions, require freedom. But if the laws of physics that control every single force of nature is deterministic, how are we going to be free? That was one thing that we had to deal with. The other one was the problem of faith and knowledge. So, if all beliefs must submit to rational scrutiny, and we need to, use some kind of right reason to understand every single, to put out every single basis of what we know, how are we going to justify God? So we also need to give a rational account of our belief in a benevolent God. That's also a problem. How can we make God reasonable? How can we make a reason? How can we reasonably believe in God? That's also a pretty good problem. Skeptics like Hume, for example, had uncovered crucial flaws in the traditional rational arguments for God's existence, and that may have also had an impact on Kant, because we know that he read Hume. But again, that's another issue. Cool. And the third problem is the problem of materialism and the immortal soul. So materialism, if you don't know, is a theory or a philosophical doctrine that believes that everything is going to be explicable and explained scientifically. Thus, in material terms, so if everything is explained or could be explained scientifically and in material terms, what about the immortal soul? What about anything that is immaterial? Our existence, our soul, also God. How do we explain that? How do we give room for those type of existence? Very, very important as well, debate during the time. So all of these conflicts mattered to Kant, and as we will see, he will deal with this directly or indirectly in the preface, which we will read. So we had that looming threat of atheism, and the contrast of that scientific view against a deep Asian theist view. So the critique of pure reason in part focuses to solve this crisis as a philosophical aim. This is a quote from the preface, and Kant says, "Criticism alone can sever the root of materialism, fatalism, atheism, free thinking, fanaticism, and superstition. which can be injurious universally, as well as of idealism and skepticism. So Kant wants to put these two worlds together. He wants to solve this crisis, maybe not solve it, but to explain it, and that's what we're gonna see. Right. Okay. So that was a little bit of a context, maybe like historical, cultural context. Now we're gonna move on to the German philosophical context of the time, what was going on in Germany, which was not really Germany, but it was Prussia. Kant was born in Prussia. So, right. We were other German philosophers doing this at the time, but what were they doing? What were they thinking? So, unlike Britain, 18th century Germany was mainly rationalist. So who were this in the rational tradition, in the rationalist tradition? We basically have Descartes, although he's French, Spinoza, again in France, and Leibniz in Germany. So these were rationalist thinkers because they kind of like professed admiration of mathematics and its methods. We all know that Descartes was quite famous for his mathematic theories, his theories on graphs, and also Leibniz as well was quite important in mathematics. So they thought reason alone can get you any basis to attain any kind of knowledge. So if the empiricist in Britain thought all knowledge comes from experience, then the rationalists would completely reject that and say the opposite. And they would say that you can get everything from mathematics, from our reasoning. Okay, we don't need experience for nothing. Cool. Okay, so the main representation of this of rationalism is Leibniz. Okay, he lived a little bit earlier than Kant. Okay, was born in 1646, died in 1716, so almost a century earlier. So I'm not gonna focus too much on him, but his most famous axioms are the principle of non-contradiction. Okay, so that means that it is not the case that both P and not P, so a thing cannot be itself and the rejection of itself at the same time. Cool. And then the second one is, and most importantly, the principle of sufficient reason. Again, there's more, but these are the two most important ones. So the principle of sufficient reason, PSR, from now on, basically says that everything has a complete explanation and there are no brute facts about anything. Okay, so he would say it in this way: there is no true fact for which there is not a sufficient reason why it is thus and not otherwise. Okay, so to put it differently, everything has a complete explanation. Okay, right. So Leibniz. So by applying these basic principles, Leibniz thinks that we can arrive at some substantive metaphysical thesis. Um, some of his metaphysical theses are optimism, which means that the actual world is the best of all possible worlds, which some philosophers may reject and make fun of that thesis in the future. Then secondly, we have monadology, which is that fundamental reality consists of simple mental substances or monads. We all know about Leibniz monads, at least just the name is familiar. At least it was familiar to me. And the third one was pre-established harmony, and I did not know about this one. So Leibniz thought that there is no causal interaction between finite substances, but the sequence of states of these substances are just as if they causally interacted, causally interacted. Sorry, it's not causal, it's causal. So causally interacted. So Leibniz explains this with a famous analogy that says that two clocks that are wound up in such a way to ensure that they always strike the same time. Although all the clocks in the world, at least if they are like wound up in the correct way, they are going to strike the same time at the same time. So everything has some kind of like pre-established harmony. That's what he was trying to get across. Yeah. So the first thesis, optimism, was ridiculed by Voltaire. Cool, right. So Leibniz presents much of this system in the form of sketches, okay? So far more regimented and developed versions of his system, Leibnizian system, um, are presented by people like Christian Wolff, Baumgarten, Mendelssohn, okay? The most important, I would say, is Wolff, or Wolff in German. Cool. So, by Kant's day, this was called Leibnizian Wolffian philosophy. And the implication is that they believe in that everything is necessary, okay? That what we call necessitarianism. So everything is in principle knowable through reason alone, which is, the main idea of rationalism. Cool. Okay, that's one of the implications of rationalism. Cool. Lovely. All right. So I think we are going to move on to how all of this background, this rationalist background in what is now Germany, um, influenced Kant's thinking. So was Kant completely against rationalism? No, no, not quite. He was opposed to many aspects of rationalism and metaphysics, but he definitely did not like the Leibnizian Wolffian school. Um, One, because he doesn't accept a science of metaphysics and he wants to propose a metaphysics of his own, but he can be rationalist sometimes. For example, the priori knowledge that we get independently from experience was also something that the rationalists talked about, and Kant accepted. So he takes some things there and there from the rationalists. Okay, so we've got a quote here from Hogan's article, and he says that the critique of pure reason sets out to establish the sources, extent, and limits of a priori knowledge, with a view to ascertaining the prospects for metaphysics as a scientific enterprise. So Kant, says that a priori knowledge exists, definitely. Okay, we can get to some a priori truths, but that's not the end of the story. Okay, that's just part of the story. There's much more to it. Cool. So what the agreements with Leibniz are mainly that Kant thought that senses do not show necessity. So that is that experience teaches us that a thing is so and so, but not that it cannot be otherwise. That is what Kant says at B3, Critique of Pure Reason. So this quote summarizes it pretty well, I think, because the problem of metaphysics is laid out in the preface. Kant thinks that metaphysical knowledge cannot be derived from empirical means. Even if the thing that we are studying is empirical itself, how could it then be metaphysical if it is based on the empirical? It would not make sense. How are you going to take how are you going to grab metaphysical knowledge from the empirical? Okay, but he also says that substantive knowledge of something cannot be derived from pure analytical judgment. Those where the predicate is already stated in the subject and does not add anything extra. Sentences of the like of all bachelors are married. You're not getting really new knowledge there, okay? For Kant, this type of sentences add nothing towards the end of metaphysics. So we have a circular problem here. We cannot get metaphysical knowledge from empirical facts, because how are you going to get metaphysical knowledge from something that is not metaphysical? But also, how are you going to get any knowledge from predicates that are saying the same thing, essentially? The key thing here is that Kant is taking the word reason and giving it a very, very narrow sense, in which reason can only provide that knowledge that is only a priori. Reason, as we said, is not everything, which supposes a rejection of the rational tradition of Descartes, Leibniz, and Spinoza. Reason can take you places, but not all places. So, as Hagen suggests, a priori knowledge is not limited to logical or analytical statements. For Kant, a priori knowledge is geometry and its applications, the principles like that action equals reaction in physical interactions, and that metaphysical principles like that every event has a cause, for example. Kant, however, agrees with some things rationalists like Leibniz have said. The first thing is that Kant, as Hogan said in page 24 of the article, Kant agrees with Leibniz. Leibniz claim that the senses do not show necessity at any point. In fact, Kant says at the very beginning of the introduction of the Critique of Pure Reason that experience teaches us that a thing is so and so, but not that it cannot be otherwise. So, in other words, experience can teach us that there are four main forces in the universe, for example, gravitational, weak nuclear, strong nuclear, and electromagnetic, but it could have been five, or it could have been six, or it could have been none. It could have been completely different. It was not necessary for it to be just four. Nonetheless, when I say 2 plus 2 equals 4, that statement is always necessary in any possible world. It couldn't have been otherwise. There's not a possible world where 2 plus 2 is 5. So that's necessary. Okay, but the fact that there are four forces in the physical world is not necessary. Okay, and that we get from experience. So Kant accepts the traditional rationalist claim as well that reason gives structure to this one here. Sorry, reason gives structure to our experience. But Kant states that we need reason for these claims, but also we need to experience them first to get them. So let's look at the example of geometry. How do we get to the conclusion that the internal angles of a perfect triangle add up to two right angles, 180 degrees? By experience. That's how Thales of Miletus got his knowledge in ancient Greece, thousands of years ago. But that statement is necessary, and according to Kant, a priori. Okay? Or how do we know the necessary rule stated by Newton's third law, by which action equals reaction? Because of experience. Otherwise, we wouldn't have known. Same thing with the causality principle previously studied by Hume. So, overall, Kant thinks that empirical reality is shaped by such necessary principles. They are a priori, but also require of experience. Those claims or judgments will be classified later in the critique as synthetic a priori claims, and we will get to that in the next video when I talk about synthetic a priori. Cool, but we have to be careful here. Okay, modern readers often misread Kant and they think that necessity is equal to a priori. But this is not the case. Not everything that is necessary is known a priori for Kant. An example is the proposition God exists. Kant thinks it is metaphysically necessary, but at the same time we cannot have theoretical a priori knowledge of it. Mere necessity, which is the existence of God in this case, does not guarantee a priori recognition. Kant's actual rule about necessity and priority is more like, if a judgment is thought together with its necessity, by which is meant known in a way that exhibits its necessity, I must be known a priori. That's also in Hogan's article. This basically means that if a judgment is known together with its necessity, so its necessity is exhibited in how it's known, then it must be a priori. Things are necessary, and a priori must show a consciousness of necessity, a sense of why that truth is necessary. Other rationalists like Leibniz and Wolff thought that this consciousness of necessity was essential to true a priori knowledge. We can also see another aspect of the rationalist that Kant took on board in his philosophical project, which is his stance on innate ideas. If you're a philosophy student or you're interested in philosophy, you may have read Locke. Locke rejects innate ideas as things that are somehow imprinted in our soul, but do not have anything, any impression, external or internal, any perception, internal or external, about that imprinting. We have no perception internally or externally about it, about the imprinting of those ideas. So he completely rejects them. That is in Britain, and then we've got Leibniz that very famously replies to Locke with his famous analogy of the veined block of marble. And if you don't know about this analogy, it basically says, describes the human mind as having dispositions. or natural tendencies, like veins in a marble. So in the analogy, the veins already lend a shape, but the sculptor needs to reveal it by polishing it or cutting the extra borders, which represents the mental reflection. Thinking and reasoning, therefore, have to uncover a priori truths, those innate ideas. It's already in the sculpture, but you just need to cut all the edges. It's already there. You just need to use reason to get there. So that's quite important because Leibniz's claim is basically that sense experience gives the occasion, but we require of reflection to actually find those truths. And Kant pretty much accept this, right? Accept this Leibniz in this positional model. There are not immediate innate representations, but the mind has a dispositional structure that makes a priori knowledge possible. So that's what he took already from Leibniz. So overall, we've got a summary here. Kant was influenced by the rationalists in that reason yields knowledge about empirical reality, the science shows necessity, that a priori or necessity grounding a priority, although that does not imply for Kant, that necessity implies a priority. And then we have lastly that a priori knowledge rests on mental dispositions revealed by reflection. Sorry about the typo there. Cool. So now that we've taken into on board all these influences, we can go and talk about Kant's Copernican revolution, the famous Copernican revolution. So what Kant introduced, what Kant brought new to the table. So the first thing you may ask, why is it called Copernican revolution? So Kant called it that way because he wanted to make a revolution of metaphysics, similar to the Copernican revolution of physics in the 17th century. So we have seen in the preface, or we will see in the preface, that the traditional vision was that our cognition, so the way we understand the world, our understanding, must conform to objects. So our understanding has to adapt to how objects are like. Traditionally, we have always thought that things are how we perceive them. Our cognition or understanding reveals the real properties of objects, and that's it. Our cognition conforms to objects. But Kant argues that this made a priori knowledge of objects impossible, because we would need to adapt our tendencies to conform to those external objects. So how are we going to have a priori knowledge if we conform to objects? It will make those a priori truths impossible. So then Kant's Copernican move is to assume instead that objects must conform to our cognition. So then we would not have the problem of trying to fit our a priori judgments, which are mind-dependent, with mind-independent things. He would essentially solve the problem. So if objects conform to our cognition, that means that reality is shaped by us in some way, but that does not mean that there is not a mind-independent reality below the surface that humans never get to grasp. This is where Kant later in the Critique establishes the separation of the phenomena, which is the appearances of the objects we can organize with our cognition, and the noumena, the things in themselves, how things are in reality, if you want to say it that way. In his paper, Hogan also talks about what he calls Kant's epistemological dichotomy. I've taken that terminology from Hogan's paper, where he explains that in the critique, ponders and thinks about in what ways can a representation connect to a subject, so the relationship between the object and its representation. In the critique, later on, Kant says, either the object makes representation possible, or the representation alone makes the object possible. So we have two mechanisms here that Hogan picks up on. The first mechanism is that the object causes a representation in the knowing subject. So object, then representation. That's the standard empirical model, but that, as Kant already explained, that we have explained, that cannot give you necessary knowledge. It can't give you it's impossible. The second mechanism, though, is that the representation, our cognitive structures, as we will see, that's space and time and the categories, makes the object possible. Okay, so representation first and then object. Representation to the object. So the objects we can know are appearances shaped by our forms of intuition and categories. Because in this mechanism, knowledge comes from us, a priori and necessary claims are possible, as Kant says also in page 20 into page 28. So Kant is plainly laying out the only two ways to connect representation and objects. And because the first way cannot give us a priori necessity, then the second mechanism must be the source of a priori knowledge we actually have. Then what are the consequences of this turn, okay, this Copernican move? The main one is that objects that figure in substantive a priori knowledge are appearances, not things in themselves, because they come from our understanding, not from how things are in themselves. First, the representation that, our representation is the one that shapes the objects and not the other way around. So a priori knowledge of empirical reality is also possible because objects conform to our representation of forms and not otherwise. Basically, Kant is here limiting what we can know. We can only know the appearances that come from our sense of spatio-temporal forms and the categories, and not how things are there in themselves. Then that allows us to answer, or to at least try to answer the question of whether we're free or not because of this, and we will talk about that in a moment. So he explains why, according to Kant, if things in themselves are spatio-temporal, imagine the speculative, if things in themselves are spatio-temporal, then we would not be free. Just to give you a summary of the argument. So if things in themselves are spatio-temporal, we would not be free because, in short, we would not be able to escape from the spatio-temporality of things. We're stuck in the space and time of how things are there, how things are, and we would not be able to move freely. Okay, according to Kant, but that is a matter of another video, as I said. We will come back to it maybe later. But a very, very extensive kind of like topic to talk about. So, giving you some spoilers, after this distinction, Kant explains how we get to know the phenomena or the appearances. How do we get to know things? So first of all, we know things in space and time. Okay, that's not a surprise. Okay, and that's what Kant call forms of intuition. And we also know things through pure concepts of the understanding, which are the categories. So this make necessary a priori knowledge possible only of appearances and not of things in themselves, because we can never get to know those. So these are the two sources of a priori cognition. The intuitions, space and time, are a priori forms of sensibility through which all objects are given. We experience everything through space and time, as I said. So its study in the critique gives rise to the transcendental aesthetic. And then the categories, which are all of this, quantity, so unity, plurality, totality, there's categories of quality, reality, negation, limitation, we have relation. There's multiple types of categories that we will get and explain in another video. Those are fundamental concepts of understanding that structure how we think and process objects. Okay, I think of unity because I've got the category of unity. So if I see a cup, I know that it's one. And why do I know it's one? I kind of see the unity of the cup. I kind of see the plurality of all the pens I've got on my desktop. I don't have a physical thing that I can call plurality. I grab that from the object, but that is already in the way that I understand things. So that gives rise to the Transcendental Analytic. Okay, so that's two different sections in the Critique of Pure Reason. Right, well, so in the Transcendental aesthetic, basically, we are going to say that space and time are not derived from experience and that they condition experience. So there is a canvas from which we paint, but we need that canvas first, and that canvas is space and time, and that can only allow us to, it's the only way that we can see things and understand things. And then from space and time, we have access to a priori truth of geometry. Obviously, we have no space. How are we going to prove geometrical truths? And we also get to know things about motion and etc. So if objects had to be entirely independent from forms of intuition, space and time, we would not be able to get any a priori knowledge. There would not be a canvas at all. And then we have the Transcendental Analytic. So the categories are a priori conceptual conditions that make experience intelligible. Without the categories, we will not be able to categorize, as the word says, anything. So they make possible the knowledge of non-analytic necessities. For example, let's take causality. So because we represent events in time and we have the category in our brain of cause and effect that is ingrained in our brain, we form the judgment A caused B. Without the temporal intuition and the causality category, we would not have a way to see events as necessarily linked. We would only see that one thing happened after the other, not even after, just one thing and then the other. That it would not make sense. We would not make sense of it in the same way. So again, this only applies to appearances. Cool. So that is a very simplified summary of Kant's Copernican revolution. So he makes non-analytic necessity true only if appearances structured by our minds. This is an unprecedented statement that I find very, very fascinating. But, however, has not been able to surpass criticism. Many future philosophers, contemporaries of Kant or afterwards, have criticized these ideas. Okay, we have a Bertrand Russell is one of them. In the 20th century, he says that criticizes Kant by saying that if Kant argues that logic and arithmetic and causality are merely features of our human nature, how our human mind works, then how can we be certain that they will always conform objects the same way? How do we know that it's not going to change tomorrow? So our nature, our understanding is itself a contingent fact. We cannot know anything for sure. There is no universal, stable necessity. So that's, in a nutshell, what Russell said. And then we had Helmholtz and Slick, so advocates of physics, would argue that restricting physical laws like the action and reaction to appearances seem to be dubious and a little bit restrictive. How can they have objective necessity if they may not apply to things in themselves? What was the point then of applying physical laws of appearances if then it's not going to apply to things in themselves? And furthermore as well, how do we know if they actually may apply to things in themselves? Maybe they are, but how are we going to know? We don't. We just don't. Okay? Cool. Lovely. Well, that was a little bit of the Copernican revolution. And now we have the issue of contingency and the principle of sufficient reason, PSR, in Kant's historical context. Right. Okay. So there's a couple of key terms here that we need to define. So, right, we know already the principle of sufficient reason. That should be an R, not an F. That says that for every true fact, there is a sufficient reason why it is so rather than otherwise. We had to look at that in Leibniz axioms. And then we have internal contingency. An event can have alternatives that are internally consistent, logically possible. Okay, so this is the key terms, but let's have a look at the what was going on. What this put context to the terms. During the Middle Ages and Kant's predecessors and contemporaries, there was a historical debate about contingency, right? So things that could have been otherwise. For example, the fact that every event has a determining cause that could have been otherwise, so it is contingent. I could have turned out and be blonde, but I didn't. Okay, so that was contingent. I am brunette. I am a brunette, so that is contingent. Because I could have been otherwise. And that the second concept, again, the principle of sufficient reason. Every fact has a sufficient reason why it is, and not otherwise. So Leibniz tried to make these two concepts, contingency and the principle of sufficient reason, compatible. Okay, so he said that even though there's internal contingency, so an event can have alternatives that are internally consistent, logically possible, God's choice eventually makes one alternative actual. So it gives God's a role there. So as Hogan explains, contingency, which for him is compatible, is something internal, as I've been saying. So that means that even though alternatives are logically possible in themselves, one thing could have been otherwise and vice versa, God, guided by the principle of sufficient reason, makes only one of those options actually possible. And that is why they're compatible. Contingency exists, but because of God's wisdom, it is compatible with the PSR. But then Kant enters the game, and he, in the 1760s, and asked the question of how the PSR and freedom can work together. So Leibniz PSR can dangerously lead to Spinoza's necessity. So we need God for everything. I move my arm because God made it move, made it possible for me to move my arm. God is the machine of everything. That could be quite dangerous, right? So because it would threaten freedom. So in order to solve this conundrum, he introduces what he calls absolute contingencies. So what is this? So absolute contingencies are facts, notably a free action, that does not have to be determined by the PSR. So a fact does not have to be, a free action does not have to be determined by the PSR. And those are the German terms that I'm not going to attempt to pronounce. And also the Latin term omnimora contingentia. So Kant is saying that most physical changes in the world, what Kant calls passive substances, are governed by the PSR. So anything that happens in the natural world, except for us humans, happens because of this principle of sufficient reason. But free actions are not passive. They're actions because they act. They're active, so they must be free. So just to give a little systematic view, so natural processes governed by the PSR, a rock falls because of gravity. That's always going to be the case. Okay, is a principle of sufficient reason. But free actions are not governed by determining grounds. A person may choose to quit smoking without any sufficient reason that makes the choice necessary. It is not fully explained by prior causes at all, so it is not determined. So what Kant is trying to do here is making room for genuine freedom. He asserts moral responsibility like Hume did with the theory of liberty and necessity that we may see in another video. So yes, Kant may be saying that his doctrine of absolute freedom can lead to us thinking that nothing may make sense. Okay, there is no reason to explain why we choose to do X instead of Y. Free acts are then theoretically unintelligible, and that is okay, Kant says, because there are boundaries to a theoretical reason we will never be able to surpass. Reason is not the answer to everything. And this is the point that Kant wants to make in the preface. That is his Copernican turn. He places himself philosophically in the middle between Descartes and Leibniz. And I've taken this idea from Hogan's article and I've made a little table simplifying it. So basically, if Descartes thought the free acts are absolutely contingent, they're not determined by the PSR, and also denied physical determinism to an extent, that's a very kind of a radical position from what Leibniz says, because Leibniz says that all acts are determined by the PSR, but also physical, accepted physical determinism. Kant is somewhere in the middle. Okay, so free acts are absolutely contingent, but nature, because of the laws of motion, must be deterministic. So again, he takes one one idea from one and one idea from the other. So Kant's position puts us into a kind of tension here. What makes us so special? Why are we so special that we can be free and other animals, other things in nature are not? So Kant himself, in a letter to Mendelssohn in 1766, I believe, he blatantly says that he does not know. We all need to figure it out. But there's definitely a reason. There must be a reason why we're free, because we have to be moral agents. We have to be free. That's what Kant thinks. So also going back to the affirmation that I have said before, Kant said that things cannot be spatio-temporal themselves. So the noumena, things in themselves, are not spatio-temporal. Why? Right, so physical determinism, every event has a cause, can only happen if space and time exist. If we have no time nor space, how is my ball going to cause the movement of another ball if there is no time for that to happen, or space for that to happen? If space and time were properties of things in themselves, then everything, including our actions, would be subject to spatio-temporal deterministic natural laws, and that would deny freedom and morality, which is the point I was trying to make earlier as well. So Kant, to preserve freedom, says that space and time are not features of things in themselves, but only forms of our human sensibility. So then free acts, absolute contingency, can happen. Thus, this kind of subjectivism about space and time is motivated partly by his doctrine of absolute contingency, and that's quite an important point. This starts a paradox in Kant's epistemology about the fact that if we cannot know things in themselves, how do we know that things in themselves are not spatio-temporal? Because he's making a claim about things in themselves not being a spatio-temporal. That is something that he knows about things in themselves. But that is a whole issue that I will have to cover somewhere else. That's quite an interesting one. Right, okay, conclusion from Hogan's paper, and I'll move on to something else. So here are the key ideas. So before Kant, rationalists like Leibniz thought reason could grasp ultimate reality with a PSR guided by God, and then Kant rejected this and proposed a new model. A priori knowledge comes from our spatio-temporal forms of intuition and from things in themselves. In fact, the noumena is absolutely contingent, so reason cannot get into it. This does not mean that Kant is breaking up rationalism altogether. That's not true. But he is just putting limits to reason. Alright, so in this second section, we are going to talk about some miscellaneous ideas, not necessarily related to Kant's critique of pure reason, but some ideas that may have led Kant to write the critique of pure reason. And I've taken these ideas from Gaia's chapter. He wrote a very useful book called Kant in 2014. I think that's the second edition though, so probably the first edition was earlier. I'm just focusing on chapter 1 though. Right, so the first thing I wanted to talk about was Kant's response to Anselm's ontological argument for the existence of God. You're probably familiar with this argument. It's quite famous, but just in case you don't remember, let's just read it out. So this is just a refresher, okay? Very, very, very simplified. So the ontological argument says that 1, God must be the most perfect being, and we have to agree that. 2, existence is a perfection. It is better to exist than not. Okay, you preferably, if you were to choose, you would exist rather than not. And the conclusion would be that God must exist. Otherwise, he'd lack a perception of existing and would not be perfect, because he would lack the perfection of existing. So that would not be good, and he would not be God. Right, so there's many problems with this argument, in my opinion, but Kant tried to attack it by disagreeing with the second premise. Kant's criticism basically is based on the idea that existence is not a predicate. It is not like red or blue or beautiful that you just can add to a concept. It's attacking the second premise. So even if I can imagine a perfect God in my head, that does not mean that reality has to match it. Those are completely separate things. existence is just merely whether something has an instance in reality. So Gaius points it out very well, puts it very well. He says that Kant says that existence is not a real predicate of an object, but rather something presupposed by the truth of any assertion of a predicate of an object. And that's page 22. And why am I talking about this? Why am I talking about Kant's criticism of the ontological argument? Because I think, and also Gaius points out in his paper, that this has applications to rationalism as a trend. So Leibniz, as we saw, thought that all truths are analytic. So all the predicates are contained in the subjects, and we just need to kind of like find them, discover them. We can discover everything by using logic. Following Leibniz, then, existence should be analytically deducible, as in the ontological proof. We will be able to logically get the existence or the proof of the existence of God. Kant here says no. Existence claims in general are synthetic and not analytic, so we can't get the truth from its predicate. As we will see, synthetic means that they add something beyond the concept, and we will see that in the next video. And it is not a nominal predicate. So bachelors are all married or bachelors are not married. That is a analytic statement, but that is not really adding anything to the concept. So, in fact, for Kant, statements like every event has a cause, or those type of statements are synthetic a priori and not analytic, because you need experience. So Kant realizes that metaphysics needs a new method, and this is basically what the critique of pure reason is about. It's about how the ontological proof fails, so existence can't be a predicate. Existence must be synthetic then, because it's not analytic. You can't take it from the predicate. Metaphysics cannot be purely analytical, because we can't get it from predicates. So Kant is searching for a new foundation, and that is his critical philosophy. So this may have been one of the reasons why Kant was pushed to write the Critique of Pure Reason. So that was, I just thought that was interesting. Then the next thing that I wanted to talk about was the certainty of philosophy, the topic of the certainty of philosophy. Pretty early in his philosophical career, Kant was already sure that philosophy would never be able to reach the certainty of mathematics. And he was sure of that. For Kant, mathematics does not reach certainty, but it just applies its analytical structure onto empirical things. So it does not do that only, but it also constructs its objects from its own definitions and then say what the properties of those objects are. So that is the idea of mathematics. It just kind of like builds itself on its own bricks, its own definitions, and we create a whole system from there. So it could be purely analytical, because you don't need experience to prove it, or to get, you don't need that experience to check whether they're actually true or not. And you could just kind of like get the truth from it from purely analytical sources. But philosophy can't do that. It cannot construct its objects out of its own definitions. Definitely metaphysics can't do that. So at first, he stated that philosophy only can analyze concepts like substance or necessity and gradually grasp some sort of definition. That's his early years. Then, as his mature philosophy started to develop, he stated that philosophy cannot, at the end, construct its own objects and cannot also be a mere analysis. Philosophy only makes the synthetic rules for the building of our experience of things and not be things in themselves. We can't pretend that philosophy is mathematics, basically. So this is also related, as we will see in different videos, to Kant's transcendental idealism, where space and time are not objective but are subjective conditions of the human mind. So the arguments, very summarized, are this for his transcendental idealism. One, that we can distinguish between substances and accidents only in space and time. So space and time cannot be substances or accidents themselves. Two, So if it is not a substance or an accident, we may think that they could be something external, like Newton's absolute space and time. However, hold on a minute, if space and time are part of external reality, then how can geometry be a priori knowledge? If geometry gives necessary and universal truths about space, for example, the statement that the shortest line between 2 points is the straight line, how can the medium where we know this, space, be something external that is outside of our minds? We cannot learn time or space. It is a built-in hardware, if you want to call it that way, of the mind. They are forms of our intuition. They are the basis of everything. Therefore, they must be a priori. Otherwise, how can you explain the a priori knowledge? It would not make sense. We talked about this, about how we can get metaphysical knowledge. So if we space and time are not objective, can we ever know things objectively? That's the problem here, right? So this is another thing that Kant is saying. We are never going to be able to know the noumena or the things in themselves. We can only know the phenomena, which are merely the objects of our experience. All knowledge requires both intuition and understanding, and all of this comes from inside. We can know necessarily universal truths, but only appearances, the phenomena. The critical part of Kant's philosophy is that we cannot know things beyond possible experience. We have seen it in the preface, we will see it in the preface. We cannot know God, the soul, etc., because thinking that we can leads to contradictions. The famous antinomies that we will see as well, and we will deal with them later. So here we finish the philosophical context of Kant and some ideas that I wanted to point out. Let's actually start reading the preface, shall we? So it's going to be very brief. Okay, the preface is a couple of pages. It's not that long. I just want to focus on the main ideas. So Kant start by saying at B7, that's how I'm going to reference the part of the preface that I'm quoting. He says, whether the treatment of such knowledge as lies within the province of reason does or does not follow the secure path of science is easily to be determined from the outcome. So this quote means that we can tell a piece of knowledge is purely scientific just by looking at the outcome. So if people from completely different backgrounds agree, that's the path of science. Everyone, as long as they're sane, could agree that 2 plus 2 is 4. They would agree on it. But if everyone says different things about an issue, maybe that's not the path of science, that they're discussing something that is not cannot be systematically put into scientific terms or mathematical terms. So that's the first quote. And then also quite interesting at B8, he says that logic has already, from the earliest times, proceeded upon this sure path is evidenced by the fact that since Aristotle, it has not required to retrace a single step, unless, indeed, we care to count as improvements the removal of certain needless subtleties or the clearer exposition of his recognized teaching, features which concern the elegance rather than the certainty of the science. That's quite well. He's put it quite well with that. So Kant is praising the journey of logic, which everyone seems to agree on since Aristotelic times. Aristotle set the basis of logic, and it has changed for sure, the way we write it and the way we learn it at universities. But the principles are basically the same. So logic, that is focused on the certainty more than the elegance of the science. Logic is quite raw, right? It's just statements. They don't necessarily have to be true as well, as long as they're logically valid. But obviously, psychology, metaphysics, anthropology, other type of sources of knowledge are not that way. What about them? So on this, Kant says at B9, we do not enlarge but disfigure sciences if we allow them to trespass upon one another's territory. Right, so logic is different from other sciences like psychology. Logic is not perfect, as it is merely focused on a form rather than the content, on itself alone and not with its objects. I could say that all creatures with a single horn are unicorns, and the animal in my garden has a single horn, therefore the animal in my garden is a unicorn. Um, and this would be a perfectly valid argument, perfectly valid logically, makes sense, but it is not true because unicorns, as far as we're concerned, don't exist. So this is a classic form called categorical syllogism. So all A are B, C is A, thus C is B, and the conclusion follows from the premises. So the argument is valid in form, but obviously this is nonsense because, as I said, unicorns don't exist. This introduces the idea of a priori, okay, at a little bit later on at B10. So Kant introduces the idea of the two types of knowledge from reason. We have theoretical reason, which is what is concerned with understanding and explaining things, knowing what is. And we also have practical reason, which is that reason that is concerned with action, knowing what ought to be or not, or what we should do. So in both, Kant says reason can relate to its objects a priori, that is, independently of experience. So he uses a metaphor to explain all of this, and he says it is bad management if we blindly pay out what comes in, and that should be bad, not back, and are not able, when the income falls into arrears, to distinguish which part of it can justify expenditure, and in which line we must make reductions in general. So that's our financial metaphor. If we pay out, that is, use knowledge without knowing its source, pure reason versus experience, we risk overspending, relying on reason where it isn't justified. So when our income comes into arrears, so when we face philosophical difficulties or contradictions, we won't be able to tell which part of our knowledge are secure a priori or which aren't, and they're empirical, and therefore we won't know where to cut back or revise what we think. So, what is Kant really getting at here? What is his purpose? So, Kant is really setting up the need for a critical examination of reason itself. He argues that before we can trust the conclusion of metaphysics, which often claims to know things beyond experience, we must first analyze reason's powers. We need to determine what reason can and cannot know a priori. Without such an examination, we risk building entire systems of knowledge on shaky foundations, shaky bricks. So that is in essence the project of the critique of pure reason, which is to conduct a kind of audit, if you want to say, in the way of reason, especially its pure a priori use. It is also very interesting to talk about how Kant describes mathematics and the history of mathematics. Um, Kant describes what he calls a mathematical revolution in the ancient Greek period. People like Thales of Miletus hit upon the idea of constructing a figure from a concept and then deducing everything about it from what had been put there by the mind, rather than merely inspecting a drawn figure or relying on sensory intuition. Obviously, it comes from experience, but then he made his own axioms from that experience without depending on it directly. So that's a priori. It became a priori knowledge, but synthetic a priori. So what happens with things like Thales of Miletus mathematical discoveries? So you create the figure yourself in your mind or on paper, strictly according to your concept. So you create a figure of a triangle according to the concept that all the angles are going to add up to 180 degrees. From that construction alone, you derive all these properties as necessary consequences of your original concept. That methodological shift, pure a priori constructing or construction plus that logical deduction, is what secured mathematics its status as a science. So for Kant, a discipline becomes a science through that revolution that developed both a method in its first principles. Okay, so this revolution happened to mathematics. That revolution happened in physics with Newton's experimental method and the three laws of nature that allows for something similar to the natural phenomena. But what happens to other sciences? That took longer, okay? People like Galileo or Torricelli started building fixed laws of nature. At B13, Kant says accidental observations made in obedience to no previously thought out plan can never be made to yield a necessary law which alone reason is concerned to discover. So, in Kant's words, we should not be attentive students, but judges that compels nature to answer the question he has himself formulated. So even though it started later on, or the sciences, when we talk about science, social sciences, it feels science like in the Renaissance. Science has been taking a good path for Kant, especially from the Renaissance, physics and chemistry and biology. Metaphysics, however, is different from the other sciences, um, mainly because even though Kant provides a definition of metaphysics at B13, um, he also says, well, at B14, sorry, his definition of metaphysics is that is a wholly isolated speculative science of reason which soars far above the teachings of experience and in which reason is meant to be its own pupil. Metaphysics rests on concepts alone, not like mathematics on their application to intuition. But though it is older than all other sciences and would survive even if all the rest were swallowed up in the abyss of an all-destroying barbarism, it has not yet had the good fortune to enter upon the secure path of a science. And many people would agree that this is true. At least the fact that metaphysics is different from other sciences. Philosophers all over the history of philosophy, Berkeley, Hume, Locke, Plato, they've never agreed to each other at all. There's no first principles of philosophy. There are no axioms that everyone agrees upon. And Kant ends up calling metaphysics a mere groping of concepts at B15, which reveals the state of metaphysics according to Kant. So, is metaphysics a science or not? So, again, we have to look at the concept of science, and it has a different meaning in Kant's time that we actually, how we actually refer to science at the moment, right now. A science, which is Wissenschaft, here does not refer to natural science. It also refers to social science in general or a systematic body of knowledge. A science makes consistent and lasting progress. That's one characteristic of science that many people would agree. And maybe people would agree that it kind of like gives you some kind of progress. It could be wrong, it could be right, but it's kind of like advancing. But that's not a thing that metaphysics does very well. It does not. It's not consistent, that's for sure, and it does not make a lot of progress. Every philosopher is saying their own thing all the time. On this, Kant says, on this battlefield, no combatant has ever gained the least bit of ground. Not has any been able to base any lasting possession on his victory. Hence, there is no doubt that up to now, the procedure of metaphysics has been mere groping, and what is worse, a groping among mere concepts. Kant was being really harsh here. So metaphysics does not seem to be similar to any of this, to geometry or physics in the regard. So what is it then? Why is it not? Why is it different from any other sciences? Why is metaphysics different? First thing that we could point out, again, there's not agreed upon first principles. The principle of sufficient reason, we've talked about that plenty of times. It's got its detractors and supporters. No one fully 100% believes in something. Not even the most basic stuff. Also, there's no metaphysical method like the scientific method. We have empirism versus rationalism. They use completely different methods on how we get knowledge. Different philosophical schools. there's just no consensus here, okay? And also there's very, very incompatible theories that uh, would never be able to agree between each other. For example, theism or atheism, materialism and dualism, monism and pluralism. Those are things that are just impossible to make a consensus on. So Kant said, okay, yeah, so this is quite different from other sciences. So how do we make a revolution of metaphysics? Is it possible? Is it possible to make a revolution of metaphysics? According to Kant, yes, there is. So this is the, although late, revolution of metaphysics. He says at, I think it is Gaius in his chapter, Gaius says that up until now, everyone has believed that our ideas simply have to match up with the things out there in the world. That's a traditional view, that objects have to conform, the objects conform our knowledge. Our knowledge has to conform the actual objects. So reality impresses itself upon us, and our job is to shape our concepts so they fit what's given by the objects. Kant says at B14, hitherto it has been assumed that all our knowledge must conform to objects. Again, that's the traditionalist view. But this has not been working very well, as we have seen. Have we been looking at metaphysics then wrongly? So all of these attempts of acquiring metaphysical knowledge by taking an object and establish something in regard to it a priori in the form of a concept has always failed. Maybe for metaphysics, the objects need to conform to a knowledge. So we do like a reversal of the arrow here. So our knowledge, arrow, objects have to conform to how we see things. So rather than forcing our concepts to chase after independent reality that we would never be able to never be able to grasp anyway, we should recognize that the very structure of our mind, the space, time, categories of the mind, scopes the way objects appear to us. So this is the reversal. That reversal is the heart of the Copernican revolution in Kant's philosophy. Just as Copernicus showed that the Earth moves around the Sun and not the other way around, Kant says it makes more sense, even makes success possible, to think of the world of experience as shaped by our cognitive faculties, rather than our faculties scrambling to mirror a thing in itself that we can never directly know. So the same way mathematics and natural sciences succeeded by presupposing that objects of experience obey our a priori spatio-temporal conceptual structures, and that is how they evolved. We imposed on our theory of mechanisms our conceptions of space and time as absolute, but that may not be the case for not human beings. A fly may look at things differently than we do. Metaphysics, therefore, can likewise be re-envisioned not as an attempt to know things in themselves, because we can't, but as a study of the conditions or the mind's built-in forms and categories that make experience possible. Instead of looking at things from the outside, we can only know things from the inside. We can only know things a priori if it comes from the way our brain is structured. And that's the revolution that Kant is trying to point out. So he also says at B18 that we know a priori things only what we ourselves put into them. Very interesting quote as well. So at B20, Kant says the difference between the phenomenal and the transcendental are you put a definition to them. Okay, doesn't call them transcendental noumena and phenomena just yet, but he describes the noumena as what necessarily forces us to transcend the limits of experience, and all of appearances is the unconditioned. So he does not call them as such. For example, that's how he calls the transcendental, right? The noumena, which essentially leads us to differentiate two different standpoints later on for testing objects, which is the phenomenal standpoint, which is the experience and the understanding, and the transcendental standpoint, which is what is beyond experience, beyond reason. He also says at B20, if principles agree when applied to phenomena but yield self-contradiction when applied transcendentally, the test favors the phenomenal application. So, if it could have been otherwise, then it falls under the phenomenal standpoint and is conditional. As I said before, I could have been born in Denmark, but that was contingent. Okay, it could have been otherwise. So that's something that's phenomenal. It's not beyond experience. It's based on experience. So this unconditioned in the traditional view cannot be thought without contradiction. We are incapable of knowing it because we impose our structure on things. So we would never be able to see things as they are. And what is the role of the unconditioned? What is the unconditioned? So is what drives reason beyond experience. So that's things like God, freedom, and immortality. And the old assumption that objects conform to our concepts, the unconditioned leads to contradiction, because that we're not going to be able to know transcendental things from things that are not transcendental, which is the objects. But under this new assumption, that appearances conform to our concepts, that contradiction completely vanishes. So that's the point. That's the point of it. Okay. So far we got the purpose of the critique, okay, which is not to build a metaphysical system, but to establish the method by which pure speculative reason can become a true science, and the Copernican analogy. So just as geometers and physicists appended the fields by taking the point of view, so metaphysics must be revolutionized in a similar way by treating its objects as conforming to a priori forms and concepts. Cool. Right. So are there any practical employment of pure reason? Just as a side note, Kant explains that at B25. He says that the moral goes beyond the limits of sensibility. So it goes on about moral being. Kant goes on about moral beings. Moral being is important, even though it does not have to do much with speculative reason. And then also says at I think it's B29 that morality requires freedom, because without freedom, morality would be meaningless. Obviously, you would not be morally responsible. You wouldn't be a moral agent. And then he drops the bomb at B25 as well. The most important, but possibly most famous quote from the Critique of Pure Reason, one of those as well. Maybe not the most famous, but one of the most famous. That space and time are only forms of sensible intuition, and so only conditions of the existence of things as appearances. So that is a introduction to his transcendental idealism. Cool. All right. So now let's talk about the necessity of things in themselves. So now that Kant has made all these distinctions between the unconditioned and the conditioned, he asks himself the question, so if there on one side appearances, there are one-side appearances, and then on the other the things in themselves, and we can only know the appearances, how can we know that the things in themselves actually exist? Maybe they don't exist. Maybe only appearances exist, which other philosophers have said in the past. So there should be an important note here, because even though it's unknowable, we must still think that things in themselves exist. That's what Kant says, to avoid the absurdity of having appearances without anything that appears. And this was what Kant quotes. So though we cannot know these objects as things in themselves, this is B27, we must yet be in a position at least to think them as things in themselves. Otherwise, there can be appearance without anything that appears. So yeah, that's Kant is not saying that things in themselves don't exist. It does exist. It has to exist. So the resolution of the freedom problem is also an answer that Kant provides from the results from this, derives from this. Kant asked himself another question: why is this distinction necessary? Why a distinction between the noumena and the phenomena? Why should there be a distinction? According to Kant, that distinction must exist, or otherwise we will not be able to be free. We've talked about this already. Applying the distinction of phenomena and noumena diffuses the contradiction of a will both free but also subject to natural law. As appearance, it follows causality. As thing in the self, it remains free. So we are free. And he says this very clearly at B28. He says, there is no contradiction in supposing that one and the same will is, in the appearance, necessarily subject to the law of nature, while yet, as belonging to a thing in itself, it is not subject to that law and is therefore free. So we can think about the human will and the two modes of appearance. We have the phenomenon, which is the appearance, and that is the will in the world, acting in time and space, producing bodily events. We need to follow some natural law, causality. So every choice has a preceding causing motive and character and circumstances. But then as a noumenon, think in itself, we are free. We are removed from time and space. We have a pure soul, a pure moral agent. So here is no bound by empirical causation. It can freely originate choices. And then we have another one of Kant's famous quotes at B30, where he says, and he puts very clearly the limits to speculative reason. He says, I have therefore found it necessary to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. Wow. That surely was quite a quote, especially if you have come from a Enlightenment background. You'll feel quite shocked to hear this. So reason is not everything. By restricting that speculative reason to appearances, criticism frees up practical reason to believe in God, to freedom, to give room to immortality, to the soul. Those are faith-based postulates. They don't need reason. We don't need reason to understand that. So he's completely broken what we call dogmatism of metaphysics, the wars against morality that has an injurious influence, and we need to attack his errors at their very source. Kant is defying the method so many people have tried to follow. Quite revolutionary, I think. At B35 he also says, dogmatism is that dogmatic procedure of pure reason without previous criticism of its own powers. What can we take from all of this then? So from these ideas, Kant is outlining a potential solution for the crisis that arose at the end of the Enlightenment period. We've talked about it in the historical and philosophical context. Kant is saying, well, if we love the reason faculty so much, why do we not apply that critical faculty to reason itself? Maybe reason is not the solution to everything. Maybe the reason is creating the fact that we put all our efforts and beliefs in reason. We have all of these contradictions about trying to put together reason and belief. We can't make belief logical. It's because we're putting too much belief in reason. Maybe reason is not everything. Maybe reason actually has limits. If you ask the questions of how much can we know through pure reason itself, you will get the answer that not a lot, not everything. And that's a question of foundational epistemology, of how can we have a priori knowledge that we have and how far it can go. Kant thinks that this rational knowledge is essentially limited. And as we saw with the controversial claim on faith, there are things that we can simply never be able to answer. And this is where the moral or practical reasons for believing God or the nature of the soul, for example, are a kind of rational faith. So be careful. This is not skepticism, because these questions require a faith that is valid to have. It's not that we don't know the answer. It's valid to believe without reason. So that's it. Okay, that's the analysis of the preface. If I left anything out, please let me know. I would love to hear what you think. And this will be the first video. Hopefully I did not leave anything important out. And yeah, have a lovely day and a lovely reading. Bye.